Hey everybody, my name is Wanda Kolomajek and I am wanting to make a YouTube video for folks to help them understand what critical race theory is. I keep coming across this with folks, and so I started doing a research on YouTube and trying to find some sort of information that would be easily digestible for the average person, and kind of dispel some of the myths about it, hopefully, because it seems like there's either two kinds of videos on YouTube about critical race theory. There's either the very eggheady university types talking about it in a way that's like kind of confusing. And then there's the what I would consider Fox News version, which I consider inaccurate representation of what critical race theory is all about. So I thought if I could create something that would help explain it in a way that's a little easier to digest, and maybe it could help with this conversation. So I'm going to switch to share screen because I have created a PowerPoint to help me put my thoughts together as I talk about this. So I'm going to switch to that. And hopefully this will help folks. So just starting off with, just the words themselves, critical race theory. There's so many people that are saying so many things about this. And really, if you just look at the words themselves, you'll see that it's not as scary and damaging and horrible as some people are making it out to be. Critical just means to exercise or involve careful judgment. And judiciously evaluating something, thinking about something. Race, of course, is a social construct, a social entity. It's not a biological entity. That's been proven by scientists. It's really a social phenomenon that exists in our culture. And theory is just a plausible body of principles to try and explain a phenomenon. So critical race theory is using judicious judgment to try and understand how this social concept of race explains the phenomena of the way that our social life is happening today around the ideas of race. So just sort of like looking at the words themselves first. So exercising judgment and evaluation of the role of race to explain a phenomenon. In other words, looking at our history and our systems, legal, government, social, education, for clues to explain the persistent struggle of African Americans and other people of color in our culture. And I think it's important to keep in mind that we have to ask ourselves, what is it that's causing these persistent issues in our culture around race? Is it that African Americans are unable to achieve equality in our country because they're naturally inferior, which of course is a racist notion? Or there is something else going on, maybe in our history or maybe in our systems, that can explain why we have these persistent race and social problems in our country and in our world. So really, it kind of has to be one or the other. There's either some sort of systems and history there at work here, or there is some sort of lesser human explanation. And if y'all are in this area of thinking that people of color are less human, then you can just stop watching right now, because this is not going to help you at all. So moving on, there used to be a time when there was biological racism, which is this idea that Black people and other people of color are just simply biologically less human. And this is really what led to things like slavery, right? I mean, how do you put people in the bottom of ships and force them away from their countries to come over and do free labor and keep them, in line by beating them and all the other horrific things that happened during slavery, unless you don't think of these people as equal to you? If you don't think of them as equally human to you, if you are holding a biologically racist idea about people, then the fact that we can treat them this way is logical and not problematic, right? So it led to things like, horrific issues of slavery, right? And then later on, as we progress into our country's history, we move on to Jim Crow laws, and there's a lot of stuff in between, I know, and I will talk about some of that, but Jim Crow laws also, right? I mean, we're separate but equal, right? And these ideas that, we said separate but equal, but were they equal? All of the opportunities and access to different types of things in our society were simply not available to people of color during Jim Crow era. And these were things that I think people were able to logically agree with and go along with, because deep down the thought was these people are less than us, and so what's the problem? And that's biological racism. So Some of these historical milestones, and these are just a few of some of the things that went on under this pretense of biological racism. I mentioned slavery already. You know, in 1776, our Constitution was written that all men are created equal. This is during a time, of course, when Black people were slaves. So how do those two go together? How can we have a Constitution that says all men are created equal, but we have people that are enslaved because we believed at that time that they were less than us? There's no other explanation for how you could treat people this way and allow that and be able to say that all men are created equal in the same breath. So then, of course, Civil War and emancipation. So yay, you know, Black people are emancipated. They're no longer slaves. All is well. Well, if we look into our history, we find, of course, that's not true. There were many instances where throughout our history where Black people did not have access to the same things that white people did even after emancipation. So one example is the Homestead Act, which is right around Civil War ending and emancipation, which was this idea that if you moved west, the government would grant you land. You would get to own this land that was free and nobody lived there, which of course is another historical problem for us because of course there were people living there. There were indigenous people living there, but they fell under the same sort of spell of not being human as well, so we could take over their land. I'm getting off track here, but it's another instance of this notion, right, where some people are more human than others, and so it's okay to exploit them, right? So use them as slaves and take their land. So the Homestead Act was move west and you can have a chunk of land and it's yours. And then you can build wealth based on, you know, growing things and having a place to live. Well, African Americans and Mexicans and Asians were locked out of this opportunity because they were agricultural workers and domestic workers, and they carved those occupations out from the Homestead Act, and you were not able to take advantage of this. You know, moving forward into the late 1800s, we have Reconstruction after emancipation and the Civil War, and white people recreated this system of oppression through Black codes. And it limited the rights of Blacks and exploited them for a labor source by, you know, arresting them for trespassing or, you know, being disrespectful, or these very wishy-washy type, you know, laws that were really only applied to Black people, put them in jail, and then they could use their labor for free again. So also moving into the early 20th century, you know, lynching was a horrific part of our history. An act of terror meant to spread fear among Blacks. It served the broad social purpose of maintaining white supremacy in the economic, social, and political spheres. So this is not that far back in our history. There are people alive today who witnessed this or possibly were even subject to it that are still alive today. This is part of our living history today. An estimated 2 or 3 Blacks were lynched each week in the late 19th century and early 20th century. In Mississippi alone, 500 Black people were lynched. Nationwide, the figure climbed to nearly 5,000. And on these slides, in teeny tiny print, I have my sources if you want to examine them later. Photos of victims with exultant white observers posed next to them were taken for distribution in newspapers and on postcards. Body parts, including genitalia, were sometimes distributed to spectators or put on public display. Most infractions were for petty crimes like theft, but the biggest one of all was looking or associating with white women. Pretty friggin' inhumane. You cannot treat people this way unless you think of them as less than. Again, this is in our living history of people that are alive today. So it isn't that long ago that these were acts that were happening in our country. So then you move forward to 1870 to 1920, and we have all kinds of situations where Black folks, because of emancipation and because beginning to have the right to vote, were starting to make headway in business and make headway in wealth because they were able to own things and they were able to vote because of emancipation. But there were multitudes. We're starting to hear about the Tulsa Race Massacre, which is where there's basically an area in Tulsa that was considered Black Wall Street, where there was up and coming Black folks that were doing very, very well. And a mob of white people came in and basically wiped out that entire area. And we're starting to talk about things like this in our history. But you'll see on this map that it wasn't a one-time, you know, outlying thing that happened. This happened again and again and again within our relatively recent history. So all of those things to me speak to this notion of biological racism. I don't think that you can massacre an entire section of the city. You can't hang people from trees. You can't do any of those things, enslave people, unless you think of them as less human, which is the basis of this idea of biological racism. So by 1997, yay, only about 27% of people held this belief that there's a biological basis of inferiority for Blacks. By 1997, only 10%. Something I have drawn there because those are the same years and different percentages, so I apologize. But the idea is this idea of biological racism was dying out, and people were like, yeah, no, Blacks aren't inferior to us. So I guess that's progress, right? Well, unfortunately, the shift went from biological racism to cultural racism. So you hear people say things like, well, it's just in the culture of Black people, you know, to be different than us. And, you know, it's just in their nature to not blah, 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 whatever follows, right? So this is now cultural racism, belief that Blacks are culturally predisposed to have a lack of work ethic, impulse control, obedience to authority. These are these things that we hear today. The further belief that discrimination is no longer a barrier for people of color, that they just need to try harder, right? We're a colorblind society. It's all good. You just ought to try harder. You just got to have, you know, a better work ethic, and all will be well. I'm a school board member, and I'm receiving these letters right now from people that are telling me these exact sentiments. So it's alive and well. So let's talk about some of the things that maybe have made that previous slide not true, that there's no discrimination and that they just need to try harder, they just need to have a work ethic, right? So the separate but equal Jim Crow laws, which we talked about before, FHA loans and redlining. If you haven't done any research on this, the biggest wealth builder for folks in this country is homeownership. And back in the years between 1933 and 1968, and it's still true today, there were FHA loans given to people so that they could buy a home, which was basically a very small amount of money put down and a very low interest rate. And so homes were purchased, imagine, in 1950 in the Silicon Valley for, you know, $11,000, right? So those homes would then increase in value. They would have, people could borrow against them to subsidize their children's education and get them coaches and coaches for school, coaches for sports, you know, access to all kinds of things because of the wealth that they had built in their house that they could use to buy things, basically. Well, redlining completely cut, but for the most part, not completely, 99% cut Black people out of the ability to get those loans. Redlining was a system where they basically, this is a government sanctioned practice of saying, oh, there's immigrants in this community, there's Black people in this community, put a red line around it, literally put a red line around it, we're not going to give any loans out there. And so these homes did not increase in value, the schools suffered, economic situations around the area suffered, everything suffered. And we're living with that legacy today. The GI Bill was another economic incentive for folks coming home from the war to be able to purchase homes and have other access to other benefits, and what Black people were excluded from that. 1944, folks. I was born in 1964, so just a couple decades before I was born. My mother and father were both alive during this time. You know, separation of the schools and Brown v. versus Board of Education, right? This was happening in 54. In 1957, the Little Rock Nine were a group of folks that were trying to get access to an equal education because there wasn't one. And so they were fighting for that, right? 1955, I have these out of order. Emmett Till was murdered, a young Black man, a boy actually, for looking at a white woman. He was lynched. You know, of course, Rosa Parks fighting for equal access on a bus. So again, these are recent milestones of this type of history that we're talking about that I argue, and that I think critical race argues, informs what's happening today. And I'll get to that right here. So what does all of this have to do with today? That's ancient history. Why are you focusing on the negative stuff? This is the other thing I always hear about critical race theory. Why are you focusing on the negative stuff? Well, because it's part of our history. it's prevalent and persistent, and we have the legacy of it still happening today. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's talk about the state of the state today. So we have, this is the situation we have today with wealth inequality. If you look at the bar on the bottom of this chart, with a wealth building by African American families from 1963 to 2013, pretty much flatline. And then you can see the wealth building that occurred for white families. They hold 12 times the wealth of Black families and 10 times that of Hispanic families. So that's one thing that's happening today. Well, this only goes to 2013, but I can almost guarantee you that if you look at 2021, it's worse, not better. So what about home ownership? So we talked about this earlier, right? 42% of the wealth that people have comes from home ownership and the ability to pass that wealth on to the next generation. Well, if you don't have a home, you can't do that. And so this chart is showing the differential in who has homes, who owns homes. So why? Why don't more people of color own homes? Why don't they have this wealth? Do they just need to try harder, like the earlier slide suggested? Well, I've talked a little bit about some of these reasons. White people have more inherited wealth. And we talked about redlining and the lack of access to GI Bill benefits. The FHA had a rating system for loan eligibility, and the lowest rated neighborhoods, which were largely African American, also were often ineligible for FHA loans. This helped set up a huge wealth disparity. Even today, if your parents couldn't get a house, they couldn't pass on that house to you and the wealth that comes with it to the next generation. Again, think about 1950 buying a house, what that house is worth today. And every single time it's sold, whether that family stays in that home and builds equity and borrows against it, or they sell it and pass it on to their children, or invest it in a business maybe, right? There's all these opportunities for wealth that comes from home ownership that started in 1950s, right? And it's been passed through the generations for white folks, generally, not all. Of course, there's lots of poor white folks too, of course. But generally speaking, white people have been able to take advantage of this, and Black people were locked out. Also, just the fact that property values are lower in Black neighborhoods and they have less equity, so less ability to be able to borrow against that. So we have wealth inequality. We have lack of home ownership, or disparate numbers in home ownership, which is related. We also have access to higher education is lacking for people of color. We have student loan debt is much higher for people of color. And this goes back to some of the other things we were talking about. If you don't have a house with equity, you can't borrow money to put your kids through school, or maybe you weren't able to sell a home and move into another neighborhood and have just the money itself to be able to pay for school, right? Earnings gap. There's an earnings gap between white people and people of color. So the hits just keep coming. Income gaps persist regardless of education. So even if they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and tried harder and got an education, despite all of the things that have been in their way to get an education that I just went over in the previous slides, even if they were able to overcome all of that and get an education, there's a gap in the income received based on skin color. Health inequity. This is another huge problem, and this was revealed in spades during the COVID epidemic, right? Black communities, Hispanic communities were hit so much harder by the COVID virus because of where they came into the COVID crisis in terms of health inequity. So another hit here for people of color. Environmental racism is another issue that is pervasive in the world and in our country. Communities of color are disproportionately burdened with health hazards through policies and practices that force them to live in proximity to sources of toxic waste, such as sewer works, mines, landfills, blah, blah, blah. As a result, these communities suffer greater rates of health problems attendant on hazardous pollutants. And there's been some interesting studies that have shown that sometimes people would say, well, that's where they can afford, it's less expensive there. You know, that's a bummer, but you know, it is what it is. No, I would argue it isn't. It is what it is. It's not cool at all. But there's another factor, there's another thing to be considered, which is sometimes people are living in a community and companies have to build something, some sort of industry that is going to be polluting or is not going to be great. And they will choose communities of color over wealthy white communities for obvious reasons. Where's the political power lay, right? So even if somebody is living in a relatively safe and clean area, they could be targeted for something moving into their area that makes it less clean and safe. So there's a gentleman named Dr. Robert Bullard, who is the father of environmental justice, and he's revealed and exposed a lot of things, but here's some of his findings. He finds that race to be more important than socioeconomic status in predicting the location of the nation's commercial hazardous waste facilities. There you go. African American children were 5 times more likely to have lead poisoning than Caucasian children. Black Americans making $50,000 to $60,000 a year are more likely to live in a polluted area than their white counterparts making $10,000 a year. Native American communities continue to be subjected to large amounts of nuclear and other hazardous waste as corporations take advantage of weaker laws. So wealth inequality, income inequality, health inequality, health disparities, environmental justice issues, and living in unhealthy places. Mass incarceration is something else that's devastated African American communities. They're incarcerated at a rate that is 5 times the imprisonment of whites. In 5 states, the disparity is more like 10 to 1. In 12 states, more than half of the prison population is Black. However, the overall population of the United States is 13% Black. So a very disproportionate number of Black folks in jail. So why? Why such a disparity in incarceration rates? Well, it goes back to policies and practices in my generation, probably in your generation, that have affected this. The war on drugs. Blacks are 4 times as likely as whites to be arrested for a drug offense, despite the fact that Blacks and whites use drugs at the same rate. So what's happening is policies like stop and frisk and broken window policies, which target communities of color, where the police are going in and honestly looking for trouble, and they're finding it. Just like if you were to raid some of the white communities where the young kids are having parties looking for trouble, you would find it, because young people, or anybody for that matter, were using drugs illegally. We're doing things we shouldn't be. The difference is the police are targeting these communities and looking for it, because the drug use rate's the same, but somehow there's way more Black folks in jail. Implicit bias plays a role. These notions in our head that, going back to the cultural racism stuff that I was sharing earlier, that they just need to try harder and they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and there's no more racism, and they are just this or they are just that. That's implicit bias, where you're coming in with these notions that you may not even be thinking about, but they're in the back of your mind. And this plays into our criminal justice system and the way that people are treated. And then just structural disadvantage that comes with all of this stuff that I've been talking about, right? So, poverty, unemployment, lack of housing, lack of educational opportunities, lack of economic opportunities. So all of these things play into causing this disparity in incarceration rates. So it's a lot of blah, 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 to just basically say what critical race theory is doing is it's saying, we have this history of doing not such great stuff. And at the time we were doing that not such great stuff, we were making excuses for why it was okay to be not doing that great stuff, right? At the time, we didn't think it was a problem. I mean, some people did, but society as a whole did not think it was a problem to enslave people. Society as a whole did not think it was a problem to have Jim Crow laws. Society as a whole did not think it was a problem to do a war on drugs, not really understanding the disparate impact it was having, right? So there's all of this in our history where there were things going on that were not great that we look the other way on. And arguably what I'm trying to get at today is to say, yes, that happened in our past, but it's happening right now too. And I just laid it out for you in a million ways, right? And so critical race theory says, we have to start looking at our history. We have to start looking at what's going on today. And what is it about our systems that are keeping these folks from being successful? What is it about our history that informs the way that we think about these things that allow this to persist, where we have these inequities? Because back to my original point, it has to be our historical way of thinking and our structural problems we have today as a result of that, or people of color are just less than us, and that's why they can't be successful. And if you're thinking that, it is a racist ideology. There's just no way around it. So if you truly are trying to be non-racist or anti-racist, you have to start recognizing that it isn't that, because that's racist. You have to start saying, gee whiz, what did we do in the past that wasn't so great? What are we doing today that's not so great? And how can I stand up to make changes? And I think that Omi and Winant, who are brilliant, I believe, critical race theorists, said to ignore ongoing racial equity, racial violence, racial disenfranchisement, racial profiling, quasi-official resegregation of schools and neighborhoods, and anti-immigration racism, which is, we see all of these things happening today. We can't argue that they're not happening today. And to see all of this and ignore it under the banner of colorblindness is to indulge in a thought process composed in substantial parts of malice, disingenuousness, and wishful thinking. And I couldn't agree more with Winant and Omni. And I think that if we start changing the way we're thinking about these things, we can make society better, not just for people of color, but for all of us, a safer, more functional society. If more Americans knew and understood this nation's long, often bloody racist history, we might be a different, fairer, safer country right now. So I don't know, maybe it didn't help. I'm hoping it did. If you want more information about this, or you'd like some resources, I am planning on putting together a list of resources that are useful if you'd like to learn more, and I will get that posted soon. So thank you for being here today.